Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about networking and security, two subjects that are very interlinked. Specifically, how the complexities of cloud mobility and a dispersed workforce have increased risks, and how the right network strategy can help you address those risks. To discuss that, I'm joined by Vincent Berk, Chief Technology Officer and Chief Security Architect at Riverbed Technology. Vincent, congratulations, you have made it to Friday, sir.
Oh, same to you, and happy to be here.
And we were talking before. You actually, in addition to your rather impressive titles, you also have a PhD in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Am I correct in thinking that?
No, you're actually right. The way I put it to you is that I'm a recovering AI and ML PhD, because sort of what happened back in sort of the 2000s, right? Everybody thought that AI and ML was more like a novelty, a curiosity. So what do you
Right.
do when you're in AI ML? So, well, you join cybersecurity ranks. That's what I did about 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like you're pretty darn employable at this point, at any rate.
Certainly, it's taken off. That whole field has taken off. So maybe we can touch on that in a little bit as well in
Yeah.
regards to cybersecurity, right? Because there's some touch areas and there's some areas where I don't think it will work very well.
Interesting. Okay. So, how have the complexities of cloud and mobility and a very dispersed workforce due to COVID-19 expanded the risk parameter and number of services for cyber attacks? It seems like it's getting more difficult all the time. What's your view on that?
So you're actually asking two different questions here at the same time, or there's at least a slew of different answers. Like, I think one of the things that ended up happening with COVID-19 is that it accelerated that work from home and then subsequently the SaaS and infrastructure as
Right.
a service adoption, right? So those are sort of two motions that were already happening,
Hmm.
but both of those have had profound security impacts, if you will, right? First of all, and most people overlook the first one, is that it's not so much that we're now outside of that secure corporate perimeter, if you will, which absolutely is true. Like, it has happened. We have less visibility. We have fewer controls, but we've tried to fill those in with CASBs. We've tried to fill those in with twigs, other controls. Even some organizations went to VDI, right? Like trying to recreate the office, but then in a virtual environment, so you have some
Right.
control over it. But
Yep.
I think that rush to the cloud, James, like one thing that has done is that we went very quick all of a sudden with that, and in
Hmm.
that, cybersecurity is playing a game of catch up. A second point that I think has really happened rapidly and unexpectedly is something that's sort of the modern shadow IT. And I'm sure you hear people talk about this all the time, because what ended up happening when we all had to start working from home and a lot of things became SaaS, right? SaaS is a true SaaS service, is much harder to have eyes on,
Right.
and is harder to secure, right? Is that, people found barriers to doing their jobs. And what do people do when there's a barrier to getting your job done? Well, you find a way around it. And
So
so
you were saying that sort of a second rise of shadow IT based on the work from home movement?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if we think about how that worked, right? So you're working with a coworker, you have to do this through a platform. That platform requires you to log into a VDI or a VPN,
Right.
or somehow it's slow or not working right. What do people do? Well, they're not going to be like, oh, it'll be better in an hour. What they do is they find other ways to collaborate, right? They start
Hmm.
private Dropbox accounts where they put
Right.
corporate private data. They go, like, think about sort of things like Slack, right? You can sign up for for like 10 people, or
Hmm.
for small groups of people, but with a limited history. But people start to collaborate out of band on work issues with work intellectual property.
Right. Well, what about the issue of visibility across the network? I mean, how is it possible to transform network and application data into actionable security intelligence? How do we catch the bad guys with their own data?
Yeah, so I think that is a really good point, and I want to take you on a short journey here. Like, if we think about the sorts of things that are doing the most damage to the enterprise today, right? That is major leaks of information, of sensitive or private data,
Hmm.
and it is what we now have started calling human operated ransomware, where
Ah,
the adversary has to get in and has to effectively get their hands on pretty much every asset you have, because otherwise, right, otherwise what you're going to do, you're going to restore from backup, or you're going to, if you have cold standby disaster recovery systems, right? The $1 million ransom demands are only going to pay out when the organization has no further options. So, so how does visibility play into that? Is what you say. So, well, look, as that's happening, the bad guys are spending their time trying to find out as much as they can about the organization, getting in as deep as they possibly can, and spreading around. Now, the traditional security defensive posture has been, throwing up barriers, meaning, the traditional firewall. But think about two-factor auth. Think about segmentations of the network, right? Those things make it harder for the adversary to move and discover. But they're not going to stop them, right? Think about building a fence around your house. That'll keep them out. Well, at some point, somebody's going to climb that fence, or they're going to dig under that fence, or they're going to cut a hole in that fence. So sort of, building a perimeter around your defense, around your assets, is necessary but not sufficient, right? And so how does visibility play in? Right. You got to watch that fence, right? Like, you're going to have to pay attention to what is happening. Now, coming all the way back to where I started this journey, human-operated ransomware and deep infiltration into the organization that is thusly required is causing these attackers to have a lot of dwell time. These fences, they throw up a barrier, but typically most of these big attacks are what we call evidence-free, right? There was no red light going off, no blinky of the firewall, no thing that said, hey, look, you've been compromised, because they're smart enough not to trip that. So it becomes an active cat and mouse game. I think it's the way we're going to evolve, where we are going to need to spend time actually watching and forensically recording what happens on the network, what happens in your VPCs, what happens on your endpoints, so that you can have that battle, right, where you can do that work.
So what's a real world example, sort of a down in the trenches example of how an attack has been thwarted in this way?
So bear with me on this. I'll take you through. So I have dozens of examples on this, but think about this, right? So the adversary is learning things about your network, where your assets are. The adversary does not, and needs time to do that, which is actually interesting, because in the old days we used to say the hacker has to only be right once, the defender has to be right all the time. Well, it's actually the tables are turning on that, because in order to extract data or encrypt data to a level where you can really hold an organization hostage, what ends up happening, James, is you need to start thinking about dwell time. How long are they there? How deep are they infiltrating, right? So if I think about that, right, that is, the longer they're there, the longer they're operating, the more opportunities we have to catch them. So the example I'll give you, right, this is very just down in the trenches. I'm going to talk about, like, imagine a custom application. A call center, for instance. This exact example didn't come from there, but it was an application that was developed inside the organization to do the business of the organization. And there was like roughly 5,000 people interacting with this custom application, and almost every enterprise has one. And so initially, performance problems were noticed, right? There were callers that were having issues using the application and getting their jobs done. Networking team, right? This is a great example of how a networking team and a security team should collaborate more. Networking team investigates these slowdowns. So what do they do? It's like, what is happening to the machine? What is happening to the network? Oh, there's a lot of traffic on the network. Now, at this point, they were observing simple NetFlow data. They didn't have an alert. There was just a lot of utilization on the link, but it was individual connections coming from a computer heading out to a host in AWS. It's kind of irrelevant to the story. Okay. The point being is that when that host was investigated, the individual took an extra step. Don't know what that connection is, but are there any other connections happening to or from that IP address in AWS inside my network? Now, that is a query you can ask of NetFlow data very easily. Right? Notice how I'm just poking around NetFlow data. I'm just sort of on a journey through the data that I've collected forensically on my network. And so what was discovered, right, is that that system was also receiving port 53 DNS queries from like roughly a dozen hosts inside the network. So that's really odd because DNS, first of all, needs to be serviced inside the network. Second of all, why is there a system that is receiving data from us and servicing DNS queries? So this is when like an incident response process kicks in.
Now, question: was it a human who noticed that anomaly, or is it a machine? Is it the system that popped up the anomaly?
No, this was, so the funny thing was this was a human trying to investigate the slowdown of an in-house application. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
It was really like, what's wrong? And they saw the link was busy. Now, what's the link busy with? Well, the link's busy with a big data transfer. That's odd, right? And this was only sort of in a corner, like a corner. It was specifically one branch office of this organization. So the incident responder here, I was involved in this case. It was really interesting. I was like, well, what do we do? So don't shut it down. Like, the first thing you want to do is shut it down, but think about human operated ransomware. Are they exfiltrating sensitive data to hold you hostage with? How deep are they in my organization? And what is the impact? So the beauty of these simple queries, who else is talking 53 out of my network, right? Who else is talking to this IP address in the last 6 months? Ended up building out a map of the extent of the compromise in the organization, which was relatively extensive. And at some point, right, the incident responder started to know more about the adversary than the adversary had figured out about the network in this company, right? Okay. And so, James, like how does the story end, right? The moment that that complete map was made by at this point taking captures, looking at that DNS traffic, wasn't DNS traffic, it was a command and control channel. Taking a look at where those command and control channels were going, found others. There was a moment where the map of what the adversary had done that was sufficiently large that all at once that could be shut down and shut out and any further damage prevented. And that's just a visibility story used for security right there.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's also interesting that it was done by a human as opposed to the system, probably in concert. I guess what I'd really like to do is look to the future. And you made a really interesting comment earlier about how the work from home mode really accelerated cloud computing. Of course, we need that. So obviously, the year 2020 really accelerated cloud. And I think you suggested maybe that network security is playing catch up on that. So I'd like to get your sense of, if you look to the future, is that catch up going to truly catch up? And, what do you see as the future of network security? And what role will artificial intelligence play, since you are a recovering AI and ML professor?
That's okay. So that's multiple questions. So Vince,
that is like, if I'm asking you 5 questions at once, which is totally unfair.
No, I'm going to answer all of them. Watch. So here, the funny thing about it is I'll take them in reverse order. Okay. Because I do think that cloud is obviously not going away, right? Like we can in fact it has many great benefits, but we have done certain things with it that make it harder to defend, right? I think we're going to absolutely see that improve, but the question of how will AI play a role in that? So we have to recognize right now that most AI systems have about the cognitive capacity of a brine shrimp, right? It's not very much. So we got to recognize where they fail, right? Like where they do well and where they don't do well. So my prediction on AI and ML is we're going to get increased leverage from it, but we're going to get that leverage from areas where a lot of human labor is happening. So for instance, are these alerts affecting a certain geography or operating, like what is common about it? Has the behavior of an application or a user changed, right? And usually changes in behavior could be, the program's subverted, the person's going rogue, the system's been hacked, right? Behavior compared to self, or self in the past, or behavior compared to peers, right? Okay. AIs are good at catching that sort of stuff. We got to focus them on those problems so that the human can play that cat and mouse game that I was giving you earlier, right? Like there is a next step that needs to happen in our thinking around incident response, which is really becoming more of, okay, great, we found, there is an intrusion, or we block this, or we see a behavior here, and now start to dig and ask ourselves incident response questions such as, where else have I seen this behavior in a network? When did this happen last? What what other systems are affected? Anyone else talking to this IP address? Like questions like that need to become pervasive in our incident response processes, right? So this is a basically a prediction of the future. Is it's data fusion, it's segmentation. It's actually also a story of disconnecting, and this gets us right back to the cloud here, James. What I think is happening is that we have created an environment where we are greatly benefiting from the interconnectivity that we've created between effectively every application, every SaaS, what have you. But we haven't yet fully understood what the complications are of those connections that we've made, right? And do we really have that benefit? So let me finish out my prediction of the future here for you, because I think we're up at time, right?
Right.
How this is going to impact enterprises in the future. I think there's going to be a rethink of the data hoarding. That's what's been happening. And what do I mean by that, right? Organizations collect lots and lots of data about their users, the websites they visit, the products they purchase, the miles they drive. But there's not yet that much usage of all that data. We certainly collect more than what we use.
Right.
However, the thought is in the future, an AI or an ML will help us get more value from that data.
Definitely.
What I now see is that more and more this data gets leaked because people don't pay the ransom. This data gets out somehow because somebody leaves a server unsecured. Data is becoming a liability as well. So I think that this sort of rethink on data hoarding is going to start driving, organizations to decide what do we keep, what could actually be critical to our business, and what can we do without, right? And that goes hand in hand with visibility, by the way. So that's my prediction for your future. What do you think of
it? Well, it's going to be interesting to watch it. I mean, it's many areas interact with each other, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to predict the future when it comes to something like network security, cloud, and AI. Those are three exceptionally complex areas, all interacting, but still, I mean, it's as good a forecast as any. And on that note, Vincent, I say to you, thank you very much for sharing expertise today. I definitely learned something. You'll have to come back and talk with us again sometime
in the future to see if the predictions came true. Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Vincent.